Hello and welcome to Big Ideas. Today we are joined with not one but two interesting guests. We have Dr. Rohit Lamba, Professor of Economics at Cornell University, and Professor Lamba is the co-author of the book Breaking the Mold: Reimagining India's Economic Future with the former RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan. Suyash, Chair of Research at the Center of Excellence at CEPT University. In this episode, they delve into a conversation on the political economy of development. They talk about different socio-economic theories, why is it important to theorize, how and when should it be applied with judgment and context. They also discuss the Chinese growth story and how certain countries led with economic development over political development and vice versa.
So, Suyash, very excited to be here at the Big Ideas podcast. So, what big idea are we going to talk about today?
Rohit, I'm also excited to be here, especially since I'm talking to you, my dear friend. The big idea is that it's not one idea, but it's kind of a meta idea that we need fresh ideas in how we theorize and think about the political economy of development in today's world. There's a lot of work that has happened with post-war and many experiences of development that we need to incorporate and create a new set of ideas about how we think about political economy of development.
But what is political economy of development?
It is basically about how the political and economic systems of any country and also the social systems make progress together in some senses. Or maybe they don't make progress together, but some things move first and the other things kind of follow later. And how this process unfolds. What are the key drivers of this process? What are the ways in which people in the country or outside can intervene and act to make progress and in a way even define progress as they go along doing this. So that's what the broad idea of political economy of development is, where the first part is political. So the most important system in some ways, which sometimes threatens to take over other systems, is the political system. But you need to understand that the economic system has its own logic and for progress and modernization, and so does the social system in itself. And when you talk about development of all of this. And there were ideas earlier about how this process would unfold. Those ideas stood the test of time in some ways, but have been kind of challenged and debunked in some other ways.
So, one of our favorite economists, Albert Hirschman, had a lot to say about this, right? And we've been discussing about Hirschman a lot. Give us a Hirschmanian context about the current movement of political economy of development.
So, Hirschman passed away long ago, but I think he wrote a lot about these issues throughout his life. But let me start with maybe one important essay he wrote in the late 70s, 1979, based on the post-war experience on political economy of development. And he referred to this, this was about development economics, the rise and decline of development economics. And he was referring to the post-war experience about development economics and the moment post-war in which development economics took birth. And it was basically a moment in which modernization theory was very, very powerful. And the theory is complex. It's not like there's one proponent of it, there are several proponents, but something called modernization theory can be read into a variety of people's work around that time. And development economics was born in that moment. And there were some key tenets of that. One was that all good things go together, that political, social, and economic development go together. Second was that you have some linear stages through which you go towards development, and then you become developed. And then one more implicit, more than explicit, in some places explicit, was that there's some Western model of development that everybody has to kind of follow. And Hirschman's reading was that the post-war experience of development substantially undermined the first pillar, which is all things, good things go together. And in many contexts, growth did happen and economic development did happen, but it was followed by rise of authoritarian dictatorships, civil wars, other kinds of strife. And social development also often didn't happen alongside economic development. And he was observing how development economics changed as a consequence of sort of focusing on national development, the kind of dreams of the post-war era. They got obsessed with two sets of ideas. One was let's focus on narrower questions. Let's fix this or that, plumbing. And the other was to critique development itself, focus a lot more inequality that happens when early stages of development, when growth takes off and all those kind of issues. So, and he, in a way, asked for a renewed inquiry into how we can again think about the big issues in development, about how different aspects of development can go together or how they relate to each other. So that was in 1979. And now in the last 40-45 years, we've had even more experience.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of things that I think were interesting that at that time were still open, but now it's even more complicated than it was. One was that, yes, the economic development happened, but followed by some political setbacks. But those political setbacks could themselves be course corrected, that civil wars happened, that autocratic regimes rose. But what if those outcomes people didn't like, and they would have then self-corrected and said, "Oh, shit, we'll go back to the all things go together kind of a paradigm, and we will find a way to build that, and we'll learn about what went wrong in the past era of economic development." The other possibility that was still open at that time, I think still is to some extent, but not as much, is that just because economic development didn't lead to social and political development in some context, didn't mean that autocratic regimes could produce economic development or social modernization. But now in the last 45 to 5 years, that has become a major, empirical reality, that in several contexts, autocratic regimes, at least on the surface of it, they're autocratic. They work their political form and regime in different ways, which is interesting to look at. But they have delivered. We have to give it some large, significant growth episodes over the last 4 or 5 decades. So that has further complicated this theorization, and that's why I think we need new ways to think about this. What do you think about this? Do you think this idea is worth working on?
Yeah, I think one can pick up on how you're explaining. There is an existing canon of ideas, right? Like, so one of the major dominant ones, as you were describing, is the modernization hypothesis.
Yeah.
Right. So if you look at, let's say, even Western Europe or the US or UK, they grew very slowly over long periods of time.
Yes.
And what comes out really clearly is that as they grew, this slowly gave freedom to its people.
Yes.
One of the things I often tell my students is guess when did America give the right to vote truly to everyone?
Universal franchise.
Universal franchise is a good kind of indicator of true political freedom.
Yes.
And it was only in the 1960s. And one thing that should puzzle all our listeners is the last cantonment in Switzerland to give the right to vote to women was in 1990.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not. It's much. So as you're saying, the co-evolution of economic, political, and societal systems, is very complex. And so modernization hypothesis had a very powerful theory which said that as you grow slowly and you give freedom to your people, society kind of endogenously but very slowly becomes more free.
Yes.
And it came into kind of culmination in Fukuyama's famous expression called the last man, which he basically said that the absorbing state of development is the liberal capitalist democratic society, right? So capitalist economic
very
system,
much a modernized
democratic political system, and a kind of to varying degrees, but a liberal societal system.
Yes.
That, as you're rightly saying, has come into question. The other dominant theory, which just recently got the Nobel Prize, is basically Acemoglu-Robinson's theory, which you can, with a little bit of caricature, call it democratization kind of theory, where the sequencing is slightly different, where they say, no, actually, it is free institutions that cause growth.
Yes.
They're not a consequence of growth.
Yeah.
And, obviously in a more nuanced discussion, they would admit that they also believe in the co-evolution of things, but they are making a different claim that the causal relationship goes the opposite way.
Yes.
And what you rightly and beautifully put here is we really need to complexify this development narrative, right? Because if you look at India and China, for example, they are in some sense outliers to both of these narratives, right? Why China? Because it has grown so quickly and so rapidly without really giving political freedom, at least to its people.
Yes.
And India, despite being a poor country, has kind of somehow sustained democracy and has got some elements of growth.
Yes.
So I guess one of the things that we're trying to say here in terms of big ideas is that we need to kind of, try to have a newer theory or at least build on existing theories.
Yes.
I think to that end, it might be fun to unpack China a little bit. And maybe think about, what are the existing or emerging new theories or understandings of how the Chinese economic and political system has evolved over the last 50 to 70 years. Why don't you give us a take on that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting experience, and it's easier to misunderstand China than to understand China. And I don't claim that I would.
That's a beautiful
the,
line. Yes,
the Chinese
easier to
experience.
misunderstand than
Yeah,
understand
it's not
China.
so obvious that I've understood it fully, but I've borrowed on and basically learned from several scholars who've studied China. I'll name some of them as we go along. That I find Chinese experience very interesting because it was able to harness a particular kind of political form and regime type to produce the kind of growth which was considered to be very difficult in that kind of political form and regime type. It is a highly kind of it's a very complex and large country. Its expanse is basically almost as much as India in terms of population. It's small. Now is even smaller, slightly smaller only. It has a communist party kind of dictatorship as a regime type, and it had almost several decades of a very brutal kind of a communist dictatorship, which tried to transform society and economy, and of course polity, in a manner that fit a particular ideological paradigm. They were trying to modernize in their own way. So it was certainly a part of the modernization effort that they saw. And they saw that kind of a revolutionary series of revolutionary steps were required to modernize. And they did those things, but it completely, I mean, in a way, it wrecked the economy in many ways. Society was, very majorly disrupted around that time. And there was, rebellion that happened from social side, that this is too much. There was famous student rebellion and all of that. And since the late 70s, they have been able to take a series of decisions, and they've been able to institutionalize certain practices and policies and made institutional changes that have delivered the most impressive growth episode in history, simply because of the scale at which the country has there. So almost 40 years of incessant growth. Lately, there has been some moderation in that. So in a way, if you see that from a modernization theory point of view, if the political, there's could have been reform within that party, the way it operates, it's probably more meritocratic now. I mean, it became more meritocratic. Now it's not. So Xi Jinping era is slightly different. It made changes in the way it interacted with capital, in the way it interacted with society and all of that. But the political form and the regime type remained the same broadly. But it delivered a very impressive growth episode for such a long period of time without fundamentally changing, without becoming a more open polity, right? And that in a way challenges the idea about uh, that economic development will sooner or later lead to political development in that sense. So challenges it. And there are scholars like Yuan Yang, for example, has tried to explain how that happened. That although political reform didn't happen at that level, that it didn't become a democracy, it didn't become a liberal democracy, within the institutional structure, they were able to co-evolve with the markets. So the framework is of co-evolution, that it was able to do a few things within that political form. It is politically very centralized, but administratively highly decentralized. So majority of the public expenditure there is decided at the city level, and cities compete against each other, and that level of administrative decentralization was made possible precisely because they had previously destroyed local sources of power and other alternative sources of power in the previous horrifying decades of revolution. And they were able to do that because they have confidence that the Communist Party's political centralization can withhold any dissent that may arise because of that, if at all it arises. So that was one way in which it was able to do it. So cities, provinces are quite free to take decisions on their own about. They set broad parameters and objectives at the national level, and some at the provincial level. But then others, the sub-national units, are free to decide how they want to pursue those objectives. For many decades, UN shows that in the work that was the situation. I'm not describing China today. I'm describing China for about 3 decades plus. Yeah, the evolution. And as the market grew, they kept changing the institutional setup to meet the demands that the market had. And so initially there was no private enterprise. They only were working with village and town enterprises. Then they allowed more individual participation in those, private participation in those. They still have a large number of state-owned enterprises, but along the way, their salience has reduced. They now, of course, over time, they started out purely private enterprises also. Initially, there was not the case. So they kept changing and co-evolving within the same political form and regime type. That's the key to understand, that they became adaptive while not destroying the CCP's foundation of power. And that's information you have to incorporate in the way we theorize about political economy of development. So that's, I mean, in a short nutshell, kind of Chinese experience. There's a lot more, of course, there about how that worked. But that, I mean, makes me think about how do we reflect on India's experience of the political economy of development, and where does that fit in or doesn't fit in the broad theorizations on development that has with us. What do you think about it? You've studied India's development experience.
I think it's it's become a cottage industry almost now, given the importance of India and China to the world, to really compare India and China, because and it's a very important question, because India and China, if I'm not mistaken, are now 2/5 of humanity. So just, and they both kind of, as we were discussing, don't really fit the cookie cutter models, both economic and political in some sense, right? So India, just at the outset, the fact that a poor country gives the universal adult franchise, we famously say, with a stroke of a pen, and somehow almost never goes back on it, except obviously barring a couple of years of emergency. But that is quite remarkable. If you look at the commentary in the 50s, 60s, nobody really thought India was going to stay democratic to the extent that it has. You can have your critics of democracy and so on, but broadly speaking, I don't think anybody would disagree that India is a very well functioning electoral and to some extent liberal democracy. I think that is already in a way in which India kind of contradicted the standard models. The second kind of deep way in which India went against existing theories is in the sequence of its economic progress. Right? So there was a very famous economist called Arthur Lewis, who won the Nobel Prize actually, who had this theory which is popularly now called structural transformation. And in a nutshell, what it says is that you basically, when you're growing, especially when you have a large amount of surplus labor, you vest whatever surplus you get out of agricultural reforms into low-skill manufacturing, like garments, apparel, and so on. And and because of that, you start urbanizing, you start having people getting more education, and then slowly you use that surplus to go into both high-skill manufacturing and some kind of high-skill services. India actually was and the entire post-industrial revolution world has grown with this model. The UK and the US earlier, Western Europe, to a large extent South America, then Japan, then Korea, and then eventually, of course, China, right, in a very big way. India mostly, I wouldn't say completely, but mostly contradicts that model by going from agriculture as the largest component, both in terms of employment and in terms of aggregate output, as the largest component of the economy, to actually high-skilled services. Services in general now occupy, one of the largest sort of fractions of employment in the economy, but high-skilled services now are the largest component of the economic output. And India broadly, not completely again, skips this sort of, low-skill manufacturing as being the dominant part of the economy, as in East Asia, as happened in East Asia in the 20th century. This is a puzzle, right? So now you can frame this as a political economic puzzle. There's a politics puzzle of a consistent democracy. Then there is an economic puzzle of skipping the sort of standard structural transformation route. And this, along with kind of the Chinese narrative that you're giving, really begs the question: do we really understand political economy of development? If 2/5 of humanity doesn't fit, it's not like it completely violates norms, right? As you were discussing with China, there is adaptation, there is evolution of institutions, but if it doesn't sort of really exactly fit existing models, should we think about this afresh in new ways and update the models? To that end, we must ask the question, sometimes we sit in our high ivory towers, as they say, and keep theorizing. Why do we need to theorize political economy of development? What is it about theorization that we constantly keep seeking new theories?
Because we are storytelling creatures, we have to tell stories about our lives and how the world we live in, and we need to seek explanations of the phenomenon that we observe around us. It is not that theories will immediately guide you towards some action. The decisions you have to still take, but when you theorize about something, it gives you some intuition, something to work with, and that's the key reason, I think, why you need to keep updating your theories about how the world works and political economic development, despite all its complexity and all its messiness, requires a certain degree of theorization, continued theorization. And even the theories that we just discussed, like the modernization theory, they have served certain purposes. There is a certain kind of clarity that comes to you when you see these systems as kind of a somewhat autonomous but also interrelated. Like you ask, what is political economic development? This interrelation between these different processes of development that go on, and in a way, the political is probably the most important, but still, it has. I mean, there is certain kind of autonomy that other systems occupy, and then we have to think about how these operate in reality. And when we observe that reality and build better explanations about that reality, then our ability to act in the future and understand what actions might work better will improve, simply because we don't have the luxury of just acting on experience. Like there's only so many countries in the world, and they're going through history at one point of time. It's not like in comics, there are multiverses, like simulations of universes happening. There's one pattern of history that is playing out across a small number of countries that are there. Out of those, very few are comparable countries. Especially if you're in India, how many comparable countries are there? So you need to work with this material and understanding of how the world works to theorize, so that you have a little bit of a better understanding to work with. This is just material for your decisions. It's not like it's going to give you a how-to guide or best practice that you can use. But this theorization sheds light on the way the world works, and then you have to decide what you want to do. Because purely experiential, I mean, knowledge may not be enough, for that matters. You are a theorist yourself. What do you think?
Yeah, I think. I mean, so this is like music to my ears, right? That we need more theory, not less theory. Especially in the age of artificial intelligence, there is a temptation to say that everything can be simulated and learned from very quickly. But as you're rightly pointing out, that actually experiences of countries are very sparse because there's only that many countries. But I do think that eventually the theories should be put to good use.
Yes.
And how theories are put to use eventually comes down to judgment of, economic actors, political leaders, geopolitical institutions, and so on. And to that end, I think, one of the greatest figures in some sense of 20th century has to be Deng Xiaoping. And we can't talk about, especially now that we have some time, some benefit of time from what he had done and what he had achieved, or what China has achieved under him. I think it's interesting to see how Deng Xiaoping uses it just as a kind of a use case in some sense of how theorization helps. Because when he comes to power in China, and to some extent the same is true also of our Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, when these actors come to power, they understand that the theory of change is required.
Yes.
Right? And how they act. And as we've been discussing, this is you can think of this as a drawer, right? A big cabinet in which you open each drawer and there's some theory. And then it comes down to judgment, right? It comes down to collective knowledge.
Absolutely.
That a community has collected. We often say in India, we are sitting here in XKDR forum, and Ajay and others often say that when the 91 moment arrived, for example, in India, there was a huge body of knowledge that had been collected, which was ready to be put to use. So that was the theorization. But then it required the judgment of Deng Xiaoping in China, and also adaptability, right? What works, what doesn't work, and the judgment of Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh in 1991 in India, to what theory applies in what context, space and time, right? What theory applies in what context and what point in time. So I think, our goal should be to keep theorizing and keep hoping that, people in charge use better judgment.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen
Yes.
to that.
So, just as to wrap up, Suyash, what as we all students of political economy, what kind of newer models, newer thinking of political economy of development should we aspire to?
I think we have to go meta. That is first step. That see, I think we have to develop theories and explanations that incorporate the experience of development over the last 200 years, 250 years. And to be able to do that, we have to also first understand that whatever theories we develop, because of this very varied experiences that we discussed, we will not be able to find a theory that in itself explains all of development. So we have to understand that there will be theorization that will be for specific purposes. It will explain how certain kind of regime or certain kind of context developed were able to achieve the development. And the more abstract you try to make it, the less useful it's going to be. So you have to understand that there's a place for theory, and you have to know how to use theory. Sometimes social scientists assume that their theorization is directly applicable everywhere. We discussed some examples of that earlier. You mentioned a couple of examples. But there is very important role for theorization, as we discussed just now, that we need that kind of knowledge to be able to help understand a little bit about how the world works, a phenomenon. But in addition, we also need a way of thinking, which is, of course, a meta theory, that how people exercise judgment. There's some kind of a theory of practical judgment. It will not be a theory of the kind that we know. Maybe it will be a different kind of theory about how people use information, apply it to specific context, how they understand their context and exercise judgment. And based on that judgment, when they act and then feedback comes, how do they course correct?
Device, yeah.
Because we already see that in the world. The way the world works is that you learn and then you act, and then you learn more because you act. That there'll be some feedback from there, and they course collect. I think there's a sociologist who call it the invisible elbow. That it's action is not just one off. You fully prepare for years and you act, and then suddenly everything falls into place. You act, and there's a feedback from the society, because the autonomous agents who are acting and also kind of trying to optimize for themselves. In that context, it's not easy to predict what your action will lead to. When that action comes, how do you course correct? That whole process of course correction, which is part of the practical judgment, is important. The third aspect of this has to be also about developing capabilities to implement things, to design policies, and then keep building towards improving those. I think these three different buckets of knowledge creation that we need to have. We need to have a knowledge creation of the kind that we do anyway, some theorization, make it just the right level of specification and abstraction, and not anymore, because it becomes more useless. If you do that, some understanding of how practical judgment works and how it can be improved over time. And I think in that, case studies and the kind of examples that you just cited, Rao and Xiaoping, it can be useful. That more analytically written, like more analytic narratives about how that works, building the understanding of the way society works. The people do have kind of game theoretic, responses to actions, and some knowledge about what kind of capabilities, institutional setups enable you, give you more choices to do things, and that may not be just state institutions, right? There are civil society institutions, there are market institutions that make a society a little bit more adaptive. It allows the society to do more and try new things, and keep developing. So I think we need knowledge of different kinds, and then we need to kind of understand how these hang together, because that's the development experiences in some ways.
Perfect. That's a good note to end on. Not only do our theories need to be adaptive, our judgment, but also our scholarship needs to be adaptive to respond to changing times and
with
new
the
data
right
and
level of
empirical
abstraction.
evidence.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us on the big ideas. So we need to keep thinking big about political economy of development. Thank you.
Thank you.